Well, hello everybody, good afternoon, and I am welcoming you from Solutions with Aquarius Rising Africa. And I'm so happy to the core of my being to have with us RASSOOL SNYMAN today, all the way from Durban. Now, RASSOOL, I'm just going to introduce you, and I'm going to read off my notes here because there's a lot and I don't want to miss out anything. Okay, RASSOOL is a descendant of the, now I'm not sure how to pronounce that word, RASSOOL. Can you just tell us of the Tegui?
Tegui.
Tegui. The Tegui people, yeah, I'll get it one day, from Durban. He's the founder of the KhoiSan liberation movement, the founder of the anti-treason movement, founder of the Demographic Federation of the Indigenous People and International in South Africa. He's a political activist, an Indigenous activist, a filmmaker, an entrepreneur, an author, a poet, a writer, and of course, an intellectual. We've just actually had a half an hour off-air conversation, which has been absolutely delightful. So there's so much we have to speak about, and I'm hoping that we're definitely going to have you back, because I'm sure not all of that is going to fit into today's conversation. But I would just love to hear from you. Tell us from your perspective how this all began. We are such a beautiful, colorful bunch of African people. And I think so many of our people have, and the cultures have gotten lost somewhere over time. And I'm going to ask you from your perspective, how did we begin? How did that begin? So over to you. Thank you so much, and welcome to Aquarius Solutions with Aquarius Rising Africa.
Okay, thank you for the warm welcome, and greetings to your viewers, greetings to the staff, and greetings to humanity at large. For us, I always believe that we should go to the beginning. And when we go to the beginning, we can't capture the entire beginning, where we were just thoughts in the mind of God, or thoughts in the mind of the Creator, or thoughts in the mind of the universe. But we can start from a particular point and take it forward, because we at some times were in an evolutionary journey that started from the time that the entire universe itself, or reality, was created. So one has to look back and say, where do we start? Do we start before time? Do we start after time? And which part of time? For me, the cosmology of thinking as an Indigenous person means we have to look at the time, because many of us believe, if you look at the Indigenous thoughts around the world, for example, and if you go to the people, for example, in West Coast Africa, they believe and that they came from the planet Sirius. Now they have a view and they have information on the planet Sirius that you and I don't know, that because you can't see. So one has to ask, where did they come from? Where did they get this kind of knowledge? You know, and what makes them think the way they think? But the question is, where do we all come from? You know, so if one looks at the trajectory of humanity, I can't go back too far because it's speculative, but I can say what science tells us is that we can begin with the ice ages, we can begin with the Homo sapiens, we can begin with the Denisovans, we can begin with another group of people that have been discovered lately, the Heidelbergensis, for example. We can begin to talk about these people, because these people at the latter end of our development or evolution, we intermarried, though, and interbred, and though we came from one ultimate source. So we have to begin to look at and say, where is that source? What is it that connects us? What is it that makes us who we are? What is it that means that we have to go to a common destination on a common journey, even though that journey is filled with thorns, so to speak? So I'd start from the point of the Homo erectus, for example. You know, the crudest and least developed species in humankind, though I may say that here, but I don't think they'd be as crude as I'd want to, as should be said, because one doesn't have a measure to say what is crude and what isn't, because today, even though we say we're highly civilized, we're crude in our behavior because we dispose of another human being without a second thought. We bring about war without a second thought. So one has to begin to ask, what does crude mean? And that's an entire debate as to who decides and defines what progress is, what civilization is, what progress and regression is, because we seem to progress yet regress at the same time. Anyway, coming back to our development as a human species, one then has to say from Homo erectus, for example, we then got the Neanderthals, the Denisovans. We got the Homo heidelbergensis, and we developed into what would be the dominant Homo sapiens. Now, the Ice Age determined where we would be and what we would do, what we would be. We don't know what genetic messages came from our DNA that told us what to be, because we don't know about our DNA and what relationship our DNA has with the universe, for example. We only take it at a very superficial level and say, this is scientifically what we understand, but that understanding is incomplete because we don't know. Recently, it was discovered that or it was asserted that the universe has a consciousness. If the universe has a consciousness and we come from a consciousness with a consciousness, we then have to ask, how do we link to the universe? And how does the universe link to us? And how do we all link to our genetic material? Because we're still unsure whether we drive our genes or whether our genes drive us. So we're still battling around that. We're working through our state of existence, and we're beginning to work through how we do things and how we think. As I must apologize, I've just got someone at the door just for a minute. Excuse
no
me.
problem. This is so interesting. I mean, yeah. Talking about how the consciousness, you know, if the universe is a consciousness and we have a consciousness, how do we link and how does the universe link to us? Amazing, yeah.
Fascinating.
Okay, can I come in?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Then one has to then begin to say, let's explore the Homo sapiens and what they did. When we go back in history, there was only one gene pool from the Homo sapiens. There's one gene pool that had a rich diversity of genetic makeup. And those were the hunter-gatherers who were our ancestors right here in the southern part of Africa. And if you do research in Mossel Bay, for example, you'll find some of the oldest findings where there were flint arrowheads, and there's research into a body louse. As simple as a body louse seems, its existence proved our existence. Its existence took us on a genetic exploration that took us a long way in history and indicated where we began from. Now, when we were there and the ice receded, the animals expanded and grew. And of course, there's always the animal trajectory. If one looks at it, it still happens today, where the animals go up to the savannas. Our people then followed the animals. At that point in time, humanity just about had a language. If you read back and you check research, the Neanderthals, for example, didn't have an organized language, didn't have dialects, for example, below that major language. It was more a case of grunts and points and so on and so forth, but it was not a language that was cohesive and comprehensive. Therefore, When the Homo sapien came, there was development because the brain structure changed. And with the brain structure, the capacity, the cognition changed. When the cognition changed, our people then started writing on the caves. If you go back and read about 350,000 years ago, there were the writings on the caves, and then there were the migrations after the animals as the ice melted. And remember that the continents were not the same. They were still breaking away from each other. Some were joined. For example, Europe and Africa were joined. There was no Suez Canal. There was no East Africa, Europe, and so on and so forth. They were just land masses that were surrounded by water, which were evolving as man evolved. Now, when our people went out, we then populated various areas, which meant we populated Africa, we populated Europe, we populated the Americas, we populated even as far away as China, and so on and so forth. And there were communities that grew there because people just didn't walk through going somewhere. They walked, settled, migrated, migrated and settled and grew communities which became people, and the environment then shaped the people into becoming what they were physically. Now, if we understand the genetics, it's a very small part that makes us who we are. And that small part defines our physical characteristics. Therefore, you'd find people physically change. It didn't mean they were another species. It just meant they changed their appearance to adapt to that particular environment. So humanity is one, but it looks different, but it's one. At a basic essential level, you look at us genetically, we are all the same. If you look at us biologically, we're all the same. But that small part that tells us we're different makes us Chinese, it makes us Japanese, it makes us white, it makes us African, it makes us Australian, so to speak. But fundamentally, we are the same. And when the message of our genes said construct, it's constructed us all the same. Therefore, we have 2 eyes, 2 arms, we have a liver, we have all the other internal organs. They all the same. And that can be proven in how we can exchange organs, so to speak.
Yeah.
You know, that brings about the commonality in the human species, and that shows you that we can exchange blood. It's no problem as long as the blood type is right. So we then went out and we migrated out to Africa, out of Africa into Europe, into these other countries or the continents at that point in time. And then the people settled, and as the numbers grew, there was a migration back into Africa. It was called the Into Africa migration, in which now there were different gene strains, because when you looked at the migration going out of Africa, there was crossbreeding, so to speak. There was crossbreeding between the branches of the species. For example, we would find that the Denisovan and the Neanderthals and the Homo sapien all interbred. With the end result, with the inward migration, there was a mixing of genetics, and that took on various forms. If we look at the gene pool, for example, we'd find that the people in the southern tip of Africa have a relationship to almost everyone, but some relationships stronger than others, in the sense that they weren't diluted, so to speak. Like, for example, you look at the Ethiopians and you look at the Pygmies, as diverse and as they seem to be, their genetic makeup is very strong in relation to the KhoiSan people. And I'm using that term very loosely because KhoiSan is not the name of the people, but it is the popular term that allows us to identify who the people are. One could then go into the sub-terms, but that's for another discussion. If we just loosely say the KhoiSan people, one then looks at the KhoiSan, the map, the genetic map, and say, can we understand this? Can we interpret it? Then one looks at, for example, the migration and say, how do we interpret this as well? Because the migrations affected how South Africa demographically looks today. The people from the Great Lakes region, for example, migrated into the lower southern Africa, the people from higher up, from Kush and Egypt and so forth, migrated lower down Africa. And in the meanwhile, the people that were in Europe, China, so on and so forth, were trading with Africa. Now one sees this last bit in, let's say, the Carthaginian Wars, for example. One begins to understand that those were people that were from Africa. If one looks at Hannibal, for example, that was an African, but he almost conquered Rome. So one has to begin to understand the breadth and width of the narrative, understand the breadth and the width of history, and look at how many stories were told by the conquerors, for example, without listening to the story of the conquerors, of the conquered, so to speak. So we have to redefine history. We have to redefine the narrative and say, should we only listen to one narrative, or should we now listen and seek the new narrative? And this is part of our discovery. This is part of our journey. And it shouldn't stop, but it should continue, because as we speak, we are writing history. Somewhere in history, we're making a film that's going to tell someone something 1,000 years from today. So we're writing history, we're making history happen. If one looks at the migration of let's say, the people from the Great Lakes region, this happened people by people over 2,000 years. Then we eventually had a migration of the Zulu, which was about, what, 300 years. So we have to understand, and if we look at the Hollanders came here in 1652. So we're talking about very short lifespans. We're talking about a very short time frame, and we should understand those time frames, because South Africa will go through another evolution as the various people meet in what we call plural societies and decide on how it will become in the next 1,000 years. Because we cannot live in the past, but we can try and define a pathway to the future based on the past values. And for me, the Aboriginal values are the best values, because we didn't have the complexities of race, we didn't have the complexities of materialism, we didn't have the complexities of the new political paradigms that we have now based on, I want more than you, I want to control you, I want to make money. So materialism came with the last industrial revolution, and it was good in one sense, and it was bad, because it led to the destruction of the planet, it led to the destruction of humanity, it led to even the psychological destruction of human to human transaction, which was exacerbated with the vaccination.
Let's talk about that. Okay, before we get there, I would like to just to reiterate. So what you're saying is basically humanity began with a hunter-gatherer people from Africa, basically, understanding as well that the continents weren't what they are now. They've obviously split up differently as time's gone by. And from there, we spread out and split up into different parts of the world. And obviously, in so doing, the DNA has remained the same, the bodies remained the same, but really the skin color has changed as we've split up and gone to different continents. Is that what you're basically saying in essence, is that it actually began here?
Well, science is showing us that it began here. Genetics is showing us that it began here. And there's no real refutation of that. The migrations, for example, show us as well, and so do the paintings in Africa and out of Africa. If you go to Europe, for example, you'll find some of the indigenous paintings there, and there's been a connection right down to the indigenous paintings here. Further, there has been linguistics. If one goes into linguistics, the Russian university, I've lost that research somewhere, has proven that the linguistics of the KhoiSan people have actually influenced language throughout the world. And that is on record. One has to find those documents, but it's on record, and research is showing us this. Therefore, we've got to begin to understand the breadth of the genetic footprint the breadth of the genetic linguistic footprint, and some of it even the psychological footprint, because we all do the same. Let's say, for example, you have indigenous people in Sweden called the Sami. Some of their cultural practices are exactly the same as ours. Some of the practices in India are the same. Some of the practices, for example, in China are the same. The values are the same because the indigenous people are the same, and through identity and value retention, they have a similar value because the source is the same.
Let's talk a little bit about those indigenous values, because I fully agree with you. You know, if we're going to different indigenous people, and I know I don't want to call them tribes because I understand that kind of separates on some level in my opinion. Let's call it the people. So let's talk about the indigenous values, like you're talking about the linguistic footprint, the psychological footprint, etc., of the indigenous people that actually are the same before it was corrupted as time has gone by. And we will talk about that later. So you say, firstly, that the term KhoiSan is a loose term that is really given, it's really just a name given so that we can understand, from my understanding, the most indigenous, the oldest people that exist on this planet currently. So I would like to get a little bit of understanding on that. So if it's not the KhoiSan, what would be the correct terminology to use for that? And what are those footprints, if you will, the real original footprints that existed within those people? Okay, let's stick with that for the moment. So if you could just maybe give us some insight onto that.
Okay, one has to first understand the organization of people. People never call themselves this or that or the other. They call themselves people and self-identified in a different way to how we identify, because we identify to stack and pack as though we're in a grocery store, which is the most unfortunate thing that happens to us, because we want everything to fit into a neat category. We want it to fit in and give it a label, and then so we can identify it, yet it identifies itself differently to the way we want to identify it. There were a number of people who may have been a genetic people who did not call themselves broadly a genetic people by a certain name, but they were tribes and clans who constituted those people. And they identified themselves as a family or a clan, which was families who generally spread and grew and occupied and interacted with one another and interacted with other families. You know, it's like me saying my cousin and so on and so forth, and we identify ourselves as a family, and now we need a name, which is not really
a label.
Name. Yes, we need labels, we need names, so we tag. But people saw themselves as people and didn't need to have anything different. They just organized that way. They hunted together, they shared their food, they had spaces on land. Let's say, for example, in the indigenous context, some communities who were pastoralists, if they had land and you came in as a stranger, they'd entertain you for 3 days. If you are staying longer, they'll give you a hoe, they'll give you a piece of land, they'll help you build a house, and they'll say, sustain yourself. Now, that doesn't happen now. I mean, now we'll say rent or do this or do that and buy a house, buy a spade, buy seeds.
Pay me.
Yes, whereas before that, there were the value of just being human. You know, in the Zulu way, you'd say Ubuntu or humanness.
Yeah.
That's what we've lost as society. Instead, what we want is a compartmentalized existence that actually splits us, takes us away from who we are, and we work within the labels to actually fight each other because it's creating tensions and creating what we call the other. There's no other, there's only the human family. And that's what the indigenous understanding of life was and still is.
Absolutely. I love that. I love that, because that is truly what I think I would love to see us. I don't know that we can ever go back to that, but maybe just to reconnect to those values of who we are and understand that we are humans. Before anything else, before what we own, we've really learned to identify with our success in terms of what we own, how much we have, how much paper we have in the bank, or it's not even paper anymore, how many numbers we have on our bank statement type thing. So for me, that'd be a great thing to go back to. And maybe this is what the Great Reset at this time is actually meant to be, to reset us back to the essence of our default, you know, to default us back to our essence rather. So I'm going to ask you, where did the term KhoiSan then come from? Or Bushman? Where did that come from? And
the term KhoiSan was imposed on the indigenous people by, I can't remember the German anthropologist, but he imposed that title because they wanted to have a label. And they used this as a generic label to define who and what the indigenous people were, because that complexity of existence was different. It was too complex for the European mind, so to speak, because they saw us as in a nationalistic context as opposed to a people's context. And we saw ourselves as a people, not a nation that is nationalistic or based on nationalism. So the understandings clashed, and that's where you'll find the clash of understanding. The other point of the Bushman, it's also an imposed label, because that was the only label that people could use at the time to describe hunter-gatherers. You know, there was no label called hunter-gatherer. So hunter-gatherer was a scientific term that was used to describe nomads who were gatherers as opposed to pastoralists.
wow. So that's actually quite a recent term then. So of course, when Africa was colonized by the Germans, the Dutch, whatever, that was the term that they imposed on the people, the hunter-gatherer people, to label them for their own mind, for their own satisfaction, for their own understanding. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. If you know, there was a writer, a very astute psychological writer called Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire says that the oppressed use the measure of the oppressor to measure themselves and measure others.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at, for example, the Dutch, Karl Marx said the Dutch were the most oppressed people in Europe at the time that they came to South Africa. And when they came to South Africa, the only terminology they had was the terminology of their oppression. It was the only measure that they had. And they used that to measure the people because they never integrated with the people. They never understood the people, but looked at them through the prism of their own understanding of their world. Therefore, their world was imposed on the indigenous people, and that's how we end up with a label like KhoiSan. They couldn't speak the language, they didn't understand the culture, they didn't understand the social organization, so they imposed a hierarchy and a manner of understanding that was foreign to the people themselves. Hence, we have the difference between the indigenous people and we have the difference between the Dutch because of the different lifestyles. The Dutch came from a place with kings and oppression to lords and feudalism. We didn't have that. we had a horizontal society that functioned very well. For example, we didn't even have private property. We didn't have fences.
It would be this, and that's really where it comes from. The land does not belong to us, but we belong to the land. Makes a lot of...
It's correct, and it's a twist in that when we commercialize land, you must remember the Hollanders came with feudalism, a type of feudalistic thinking. And feudalism is never inherent in any indigenous people. Go to all of them, you'll see that they all have the same sort of approach, that you respect the land, you respect the animals, you treat them well, and they in turn will treat you well. Whether you go to the indigenous Samis, whether you go to, for example, the indigenous people in the Americas, or you go to the indigenous people in Japan, same philosophy, same understanding, same application. Yeah. There's no such thing as butcher everything you see in sight and turn it into a steak for sale.
Absolutely.
You know, that commercialization brought about, and that is what destroyed us, because we would destroy the world to have a gold ring or a diamond watch, or, you know, something like that, or Mercedes-Benz or Rolls-Royce. So our values and the trade was different because we destroyed to create. But what we created did not have the measure of the destruction. I can't remember who said when the last whale has been killed and the last buck has been shot and the last fish has been taken or fished out of the river, we'll realize that we can't eat money.
Exactly. Yeah, I've definitely seen that, and I've used that quite a few times over the past few years. So what would be the term, I mean, that would be most, in your opinion, that is, I'm just asking you your personal opinion, yeah, to take the label away of the Bushman or the KhoiSan that the colonizers have pretty much labeled the people with on this continent. What do you think would be a beautiful word to define the people?
Yeah, beautiful.
So that's it. It doesn't need to have a label. Why should it have a label? Why should it fit into the house that we created? If we say we are the people, that's the people. If we say the original people that talks about the origins of the genetic, that's it. What more do you need?
Absolutely. And I love that because also, you know, with our connections to Australia as well, they don't call the Aboriginal people the Aboriginals. They call them the original people, which is beautiful. And I think the people of this country, of this continent, the original people, could not be more descriptive. So let's talk a little bit about the culture of our people. What, you know, I completely understand that this whole, I don't eat meat. So I've long ago, I hear the voices of the animals, I speak to them. So long ago has that not made sense to me, to kill and slaughter and have slaughterhouses hiding behind mountains where the average person cannot see what's going on there, and our animals are tortured into another dimension before they end up on our plate. That's my experience of what I've seen. So let's talk a little bit how a hunter-gatherer would gather their meals. I think that is so beautiful in the way that I understand they would kill an animal to be their food. My internet seems like it's unstable. So if you could just give us, again, from your perspective, I would love to hear about that.
Well, the first thing that one has to realize is that people only killed for food. not surplus. There was no such thing as killing for surplus, no such as killing for trade, no such thing as trading in life, even if it's animal life. What happens is, if a person had to kill an animal, if he killed the animal, he would pray and speak to the animal and say, I apologize for having to kill you, but I have to live. You know, and people used other means, for example, that's why they call gatherers. They used to use other means to eat plants. So it was, a lot of it was vegetarian, so to speak. And some of it was through, what do you call the term if we meat eaters? Carnivores, because we're carnivores to some extent. But we weren't commercial carnivores, so to speak. It wasn't about kill 2 animals and waste 1. You know, kill 2 animals and I'll eat 1 and I'll sell 1 to my neighbor. It was a matter of taking the least that you could take, but it was a way of culling as well, because hunting means you take the weakest of the animals which is about to die. You know, it's not a matter of going for the fittest, because you can't catch the fittest. So nature gives you that sort of balance, where there's a culling process that happens, and not by design, for example. And we wouldn't go, for example, and kill a calf. It's against the ethos, because a calf is like killing a child. A calf is killing a baby. So what we would look at it, at the animal and the grown animal, and hunt it down. And the weakest, if you look at nature itself, the weakest gets culled, not the strongest, because the strongest still has to procreate, the strongest still has to defend the herd, the strongest still has to go about its daily business by being part of a healthy herd. However, the weakest always get culled, because they are going to die anyway. So one has to look at the balance of how the indigenous people fit into nature as opposed to creating nature. For example, killing a calf, what does that mean in the broadest sense of the word? Yet at the same time, we as humans would object if someone took our kids and ate them. You know, we'd be horrified. We'd say, but that was a child. But what does the animal say? You know, that's not my child too. You know, I've actually written a piece on this. I wrote something on eggs. You know, we cry about abortion, but we eat eggs. You know, how do we balance the 2 values? Because those are contradictory values that the one negates the other. How do we do this? You know, so there are lots of values we have as humans that we need to explore. We need to look back on and say, does this make sense? And how does it make sense? Is it avoidable? And then take it from there. As you were saying about reset, I think there needs to be a lot that goes into the reset, because there has to be a reset of values. There has to be a reset as to how the world functions as it functions. There has to be a reset in terms of materialism and non-materialism. There has to be a reset in terms of our emotions and desires, and look at how do we cater for wants versus needs. How do we cater for that? Because what we need has to keep us alive, but what we want can go to the ceiling. You know, how do we balance this? So I think the reset it's time for it to happen, but not the reset that we're looking at by the pharmaceutical companies, but a reset, a reset of values that are people-based, humanity-based. And we have to stop along this trajectory that we're following, because, you know, there's a saying, they say, no matter how far down a bad road you have gone, it's never too late to turn back, and we need to turn back, or the planet will be destroyed. I mean, for example, if you look at the Kenyan waters, they have been fished to sterility. You know, we fish and then we eat the fish roe. How does the fish propagate? We eat it to extinction. We're not going to be able to eat the money. So we need to stop somewhere and say, let's change how we think.
Absolutely. What would your advice be in terms of that, for where we clearly have really, and it's so true, because, you know, veal, for example, and lamb has become a delicacy in restaurants and things like that. I find it appalling, absolutely appalling. Chicken, you know, anything like that. You know, when we're looking at these you know, I call them the Lucy's. Monet has popped out, I'm sure he'll be back soon, who literally consume our children. Yet we don't think twice about consuming baby animals, stuff like that. What would your advice be for this humanitarian reset, which is what I would like to see happen, most definitely? How do you think we as individuals can go about doing things differently in a more conscious way, that we are respectful to all of life?
Well, the first thing is we have to call things what they are. You know, what is veal? That's a nice name to eat some baby.
Yeah.
You know, we have to first relabel what we eat. Then we have to put prohibitions on it. And then we have to use the media to bring about a consciousness of what this constitutes. The first thing that they do, remember, they sold it to us. They sold it to us as veal is a delicacy. They show you on the table. They show you, you know, a well-dressed family sitting down and eating the veal, and someone takes a bite and says, "Oh, how great!" Maybe it's time to show the mother's emotions when the baby is taken to be slaughtered and then fed to people who want to eat it simply because the meat is softer. You know, so one has to do an analysis of how did we get here, and then say, how do we go back to the values that we had? The media is one of the culprits that brought us up to this point. The media. So it's our
talking
mind.
about the media, absolutely. Oh my goodness, yeah.
I would say read this guy Edward Bernays. Really read him and watch his movie, and then we take it from there, because that is a separate discussion as to how values are created. Values are always created. I mean, for example, right now you'd get a student who needs education and fees, who would take his fees money and buy a Levi's jeans. So he has a value system that weighs his education as opposed to wearing a brand, a label that makes him feel good, yet he may not be good, but he sacrifices something that's good to have this thing that has no value. So the twist in our values happened on how they marketed it to us. They no more market about what you need, they market about what you want, what you desire, what you want to be or could be. You know, you're never human until you wear Levi's jeans.
Yeah.
You know, you're not a male until you wear Nike tacky.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And we have to look at building our character to understand that labels are meaningless. Labels mean nothing. You could buy a jeans that is better than Levi's, better cut, better twill than a Levi's jean, but you spend your money, which might well be 2,000 Rand, and the jeans actually cost 30 Rand. So it's in our minds. Here is the biggest problem that we need to deal with as soon as we possibly can.
I fully agree with that. To go back to, again, I'm going to say the great humanitarian reset of understanding what our true values are, of understanding community living, growing our own food, not having this fast food that has now become the order of the day. We've really become quite a narcissistic society, haven't we? I've been saying this for a long time.
Well, one has to look at the criminality involved in Indigenous living and the material society. For example, Leopold, for example, killed people in Congo, in
Congo,
Belgium.
yeah.
Why? To have tires, more rubber to have tires. And that was for more people to drive around in cars and for them to have balls and luxury. So it's again the same system as taking something with a valuable benefit and merging it, so to speak, for a value that's only valuable to you, but is not a value in broader society. It's material. You know, imagine your car tires, a blood car tire. It costs people their hands. It costs people their lives. You know, so exploitation is something that we all have to be very wary of, because exploitation is still here. I mean, we look at, for example, slavery, and we look at, for example, sweatshops, same story. It's the same thing with minor differences, but the same thing. So the values have to change in society. The capitalistic model does not work. The materialistic model does not work, because we are all just commodities. We are not people as people in humanity, but we are mere commodities that can be bought and sold. And this can be seen in, for example, how the IMF, how the World Bank operates, where poverty is created, and then the country is exploited, and from its exploitation, some of the wealth is given back as aid. You know, a pittance is given back as aid. In the meanwhile, people are dying from hunger. So this is definitely not the world that we want, but a new world that we should fight for. And I think it's time that we should all become warriors for the fight, to become warriors of the fight in this revolution. And the first part of the revolution is calling it what it is, demystifying it. Stop calling it by these nice names. You know, let's call it what it is. Let's call the murder of cattle, for example, or the murder of calves. Let's call it the murder of calves. Shouldn't be called the provision of veal, because that's a nice name, but it's not a nice thing. So congruence is necessary in how we think and do things.
I so agree with that. I mean, just talking about the Congo and the mining, I mean, we know that the Congo is one of the richest, if not the richest African country, with its wealth of resources, yet there's so much going on there, and the amount of child labor, the amount of women and children that are forced to work in those mines, losing their hands, the rebels and the militia that's taken over there, and just, you know, going back to, as you say, Leopold, raping the resources of this country, of this continent, and having the diamonds cut in Antwerp in Belgium, and have the European woman wear the big fat diamonds and gold that has come out of Africa. Yet this continent, the continent is not poor. We have probably I do believe the richest continent on this planet, yet the people are poor. Why is that? You know, well, so these things have to change. Carry on, sorry.
No, well, one has to look at the political structures. One has to look at colonialism. One has to look at neo-colonialism. And one has to look at the transfer of value. There's something called the replacement philosophy. It's where you take good ideas, you take good values, and you replace those values. You take good identities and you replace those identities. Now, we have seen a lot of this happen, even here in South Africa, for example. We now have the Oppenheimers, for example, still mining. We have De Beers still mining. We have Lonman still mining. But generally, the people are poor. We have the most disparate company or economy in the world. And this is right on our doorstep. If you look at, for example, Congo or Peru, and you look at how the people are being killed and exploited, I mean, young children have a life expectancy of what? 14 years. Now you use children in mining, you use children in processing gold, and they only live to the age of 14 years old and they were born poor, they're going to die poor, and the gold is going somewhere else. So all of this has to change. You have to change the market, you have to change the middleman, you have to change the methodology of the miner and look at the system. If there's no market, there's no mining. If there's a market, there's mining. So we have to look at how did we end up giving value to these things? What was the value judged against? You know, they say always compared to what? What do we value something as? Does the JSE decide what the value of any commodity should be? Where are the real values? How do we engage the values? How do we shape the values? How do we change the values? The first thing is we have to identify who these people are, and we need to engage these people, and we need to engage, let's say, what the market constitutes. A woman wearing diamonds that are blood diamonds should be called blood diamonds. Yeah, her diamonds should be called blood diamonds. The same thing with food, it should be blood food. GMOs should be blood food, for example, because they control and manipulation. Vaccinations should be blood vaccinations because they bring money that's based on blood and death and the harm to human beings. So we have to have a rethink, we have to have a strategy, we have to begin to rethink the values that we have and take back the indigenous values and recreate the indigenous values and ensure that the land is in the control of indigenous people who practice the kinds of indigenous values that they have. Or it all becomes theoretical unless the land question is settled and the indigenous question is settled, for example.
I would love to talk about this whole land issue at this point in Africa, but I somehow think we're probably going to need another little while for that. I don't know, can we maybe touch on that? Because, you know, there's such a land issue happening here right now. We understand the murder of farmers, etc., by a lot of the African people. It also understand from what history dictates, so to speak, that the land actually belongs to the indigenous people, as we've ascertained. So what is your feeling on that when it comes to who owns the land and all this land grabbing that's going on right now, the properties, the mines, the wealth, etc.? It's just a big, fat, chaotic carnage out there right now.
Well, one has to understand the land question in its proper context. Land has three components. Land, you have the ownership of the land, you have the productive values of the land, and you have the minerals that are in the land. Then you have the seas and the skies. Now, we cannot conflate all these things. For example, when we look at the colonial attack on the indigenous people, the first thing they took was the land, because the land produced and the land kept you wealthy and the land gave you surplus values. Now, to take the land, they had to get involved in criminality. The criminality had to be the murder of the indigenous people, the introduction of private property, for example, and the introduction of forms of government, which the indigenous people never had. They never cared for that. They believed in communalism, for example, where everyone shares the land, everyone lives off the land, no one exploits it, no one decimates and destroys the land. Now, that was the first problem that emerged. The second problem became the politics that were brought in, because when the politics were brought in, it was brought in on the back of the economics. For example, capitalism was there at the inception, where the land became, rather than something of sustenance, it became a commodity to be traded. If the ruling class, for example, decided to take land, what they do, they give the settlers pieces of land so they could protect the ruling class. They could protect the companies, because remember, it was the Dutch East Indian Company that was here. It was a company. It wasn't an
Yeah.
invasion of private people. It was a company that looked after its interests and used the settlers to be the buffer between the natives and themselves, and it worked very well. Now, if one understands this, this was only the productive values and the ownership values. Later on, when they discovered diamonds, then it became the minerals in the soil which linked to the productive value, which meant instead of the indigenous people simply being commodities where their land could be taken, they became cheap labor. So they were used to dig their own mines and give the diamonds to a company that was taking the money out of the country. Because these diamonds never disappear into thin air, they went somewhere. They went to Europe, they went to Britain, they went to Holland. Now one has to understand, these countries built their economies on the back of these diamonds. And in the meanwhile, the poverty was here all the time. This led into, let's say, the spatial development. For example, there were hostels that were created, which meant that when the indigenous people got sick from the diseases that the colonizers brought, then it killed the indigenous people because genetically they weren't equipped to deal with smallpox. Now there were 7 smallpox epidemics which decimated the indigenous people. That's why today you look at reduced numbers, yet there were a people of millions in the countryside, and many of them died because of smallpox 7 times. Now this takes us to another part, a more tragic part as well, is when, for example, we talk about the Dome Pass, but indigenous people had to carry a piece of wood around their necks that indicated that they were slaves and they couldn't go from one farm to the next until they had permission from the farm owner. Now this began to set in place a dangerous trend where the people disregarded and disrespected the farmers because of the oppression. And the farmers were fodder to protect the business. And this still happens today. For example, you'll find the people that are on farms today are the ordinary farmers, but above them are the banks, above them are the corporations, above them are the miners, like the De Beers and the Oppenheimers and so forth. And those are the people who control the politics. Now, if we look at that political structure, you'll find that the land question was never dealt with. In 1994, the land question was never dealt with. The indigenous question on land was never dealt with, and up till today, we still find the same. Now, when we look at the land question, for example, the farmer is the face of the land question, but the land question is beyond the farmer. He's just the face. He's just the one that's making some money, sending his crop to the market, and he becomes the face of the problem. But deeper, one has to look at the corporations. For example, if one in KZN, there's a company called Crooks Brothers. If you look at Crooks Brothers and you look at the land they own throughout Africa, it's a wonder no one has gone to Crooks Brothers and said, give us our land. No one. No one has gone to De Beers and said, give us our land. So if you look at the land question does not simply have a color component, it also has a class component. It also has a political component. And further, after 1994, when the higher classes within the colonial forces controlled the government or gave us the government, they gave us a government that would not address the land issue and settle the land issue on a people-by-people basis where we could have a referendum and have representation by all the people. What government did, it got people together as government to negotiate on the terms that they felt were important, not the people. Hence today, we have a poor people fighting with farmers, looking for land and economic betterment, yet the problem is with the government and the economic system, because the economic system resides with government, the economic system resides with these corporations, the economic system resides with the miners and bankers. So we have to reprioritize the land question and say, and redefine it to say, where lies the problem? Because if we don't deal with the problem substantively, it's gonna bog our footprint, our footsteps forever. Believe me, there's no peace without justice, and there needs justice. And the beginning of justice is also the correction of government and the governmental system.
I agree. And when we look at the politics, and it's absolutely true what you say, the hierarchy, you know, the farmer is just really the face of the problem, and probably an easier target than going to Crook's brothers, Beers, or the Oppenheimers, or the Ruperts, who really are, and we know that they are handled by the Rothschilds. So really, at the end of the day, the country, who does this country really belong to? You know, the politicians or the puppets for the puppet masters. And I think that has to become clear as we go along as well, is that who are the puppet masters in Africa? What is their agenda? Because it's not, as you say, the face of the problem, which is really the ordinary farmer. Yes, the ordinary farmer is probably battling to make a living. You know, you're at the mercy of the elements, kind of putting food on everyone's table. But yes, and then there's the bank, then there's the banks, then there's the miners, and then there's the, you know, the politicians, and then the handlers of the politicians. So it is absolutely crucial, I think, that what you're saying is that transparency is required. We need to be sitting down, negotiating with the powers that be, so to speak, and to rectify some huge injustices in this country, for sure. And not just this country, but the whole continent of Africa, I do believe.
Well, there are several levels of the problem. One has to look at the international level, one has to look at the continental level, one has to look at the regional level as well. And one has to define the difference and connections between the three. In the continental context, globalization has been driven by money, has been driven by, let's say, the Rothschilds and so on and so forth, because globalization meant that land is cheaper, resources are cheaper, and what happens, the manipulation of people is easier. So that was the one aspect. The other one is at a continental level. If you looked at colonialism, it was driven by money, and it was driven by interest, because if you look back at even things like slavery, the bankers had an integral part in slavery, the bankers, and no one talks about the bankers. The bankers, if you go to the London Museum, you see a whole list of the bankers, and the bankers are there. Their footprint has been covered up very, very good, very, very deceitfully, and it's been covered up today. If you look at the Rothschilds, for example, one hasn't asked, I haven't heard this question being asked, how much money did they make from slavery? You know, no one asks that question. We ask the common man. But again, it's about class. We don't go to the higher classes. We don't fight the king. We want to fight the ordinary soldier on the street who's just a victim as much as you. So we haven't learned to identify the system in itself. So we need a whole lot of education where it's no more simply black versus white, black versus green, black versus blue. That's a color war. We are not into a color war. We're into a monetary war of control, a monetary war where there's control of the controllers. And that is the kind of thing that escapes us because we don't want to engage complex problems. We want the simplest solution, and the simplest solution is not the easiest or correct solution, it's just simple. So we need to rethink, we need to become thinkers. You know, like you were saying earlier, we think, but do we think?
Absolutely. And being sentient beings, we will oftentimes let our emotions get the better of us. But RASSOOL, it's been, I see our time has reached its limit. I would love for you, if you agree, to please come back and let's talk further, because I think there's so much that needs to be spoken about. And as you say, you know, to find ways, we've got to become critical thinkers. We've got to find ways that we can find solutions, become more solution orientated, as opposed to just get mad at each other, create chaos and mayhem, and find resolutions for the situation that we are in. Thank you so much for your time today. I don't know, is there anything just in closing that you would like to say?
Well, I think that we need to begin to think if we're thinking. I think we need to look at the institutions that make us think we're thinking. I think we need to look at the formulation of government and how it operates, because right now we're dealing with elitism, we're dealing with, for example, a government or governments that tell you they are the power, yet you are the power. We need to look at the structures of government and bringing better structures, in a sense that we should have a people's government that has civilian oversight over the people. We need to change laws to ensure that the politicians look after the interests of the people, not the interests of themselves or the interests of their masters. And if they do, they should be charged with treason, because by every definition, anyone who betrays people who have given them something in trust, that person commits treason. So we need a rethink, and we need to look at our politics. We say we have a democratic dispensation, but we don't have a democratic dispensation. We have, for example, a representative dispensation where we have feudal kings and lords in the form of presidents and ministers, and that needs to go out the window as soon as possible.
Absolutely. I definitely look forward to chatting with you further. And thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. You've got some amazing pearls of wisdom to share. And I would love for us to find ways to go back to the humanitarian reset, not this other reset they're talking about. We've got to flip that around and make it work for the people and the indigenous people. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I just hope we're not going to jump from the frying pan into the microwave.
I don't use a microwave, thank God. So I just want to go from the frying pan out onto the lawn and onto the beach. Thank you, RASSOOL. Well, guys and girls, and to all our viewers, thank you so much for watching. Fascinating, riveting, and really so grateful to have RASSOOL SNYMAN with me today, and definitely look forward to having him back with us in the future. So if you haven't already, please give us a like, a share, and a subscribe on Solutions with Aquarius Rising Africa. We will be posting this interview on Aquarius Rising Africa as of tomorrow as well, when the main channel is up and running. So until then, God bless you all, take good care, and we shall catch you very